Good evening, and welcome to another installment of Fairy Tale. The last episode, we started off reading The Little Mermaid, and we had just gotten to the point where the youngest of the king's daughters has decided to save a prince from stormy seas. That's where we last left off. And this is where we continue. In the morning the storm had ceased, but of the ship not a single fragment could be seen. The sun rose up red and glowing from the water, and its beams brought back the hue of health to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high, smooth forehead and stroked back his wet hair. He seemed to her like a marble statue in her little garden. And she kissed him again, and wished that he might live. Presently they came in sight of land. She saw lofty blue mountains on which the white snow rested, as if a flock of swans were lying upon them. Near the coast were beautiful green forests, and close by stood a large building, whether a church or a convent she could not tell. Orange and she wouldn't know what a church or convent is. Anyways, sidetracked. I digress. Orange and citron trees grew in the garden, and before the door stood lofty palms. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water was quite still but very deep. So she swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with fine white sand, and there she laid him in the warm sunshine, taking care to raise his head higher than his body. Then bells sounded on a large white building, and a number of young girls came into the garden. The little mermaid swam out farther from the shore and placed herself between some high rocks that rose out of the water. Then she covered her head and neck with the foam of the sea so that her little face might not be seen, and watched to see what would become of the poor prince. She did not wait long before she saw a young girl approach the spot where he lay. She seemed frightened at first, but only for a moment. Then she fetched a number of people, and the mermaid saw that the prince came to life again, and smiled upon those who stood around him. But to her he sent no smile. He knew not that she had saved him. This made her very unhappy, and when he was led away into a great building, she dived down sorrowful into the water, and returned to her father's castle. She had always been silent and thoughtful, and now she was more than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her first visit to the surface of water, but she could not tell them anything. Many an evening and morning did she rise to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits in the gardens ripen till they were gathered. The snow on the tops of the mountains melted away, but she never saw the prince, and therefore she returned home, always more sorrowful than before. It was her only comfort to sit in her own little garden and fling her arm around the beautiful marble statue, which was like the prince, but she gave up tending her flowers, and they grew in wild confusion over the paths, twining their long leaves and stems around the branches of the trees, so that the whole place became dark and gloomy. At length she could bear it no longer, and told one of her sisters all about it. Then the others heard the secret, and very soon it became known to two mermaids whose intimate friends happened to know who the prince was. Ooh. She had also seen the festival on board ship, and she told them where the prince came from and where his palace stood. "Come, little sisters," said the poor princess. Then they entwined their arms and rose up in a long row to the surface of the water, close by the spot where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was built of bright yellow shining stone, with long flights of marble steps, on of which reached quite down to the sea. Splendid gilded cupolas rose over the roof, and between the pillars that surrounded the whole building stood lifelike statues of marble. Through the clear crystal and lofty windows could be seen noble rooms, whose costly silk curtains and hangings of tapestry, while the walls were covered with beautiful paintings which were a pleasure to look at. In the center of the largest saloon, A fountain threw its sparkling jets high up in the glass cupola of the ceiling, through which the sun shone down upon the water and upon the beautiful plants growing around the basin of the fountain. Now that she knew where he lived, she spent many an evening and many a night on the water near the palace. She would swim much nearer the shore than any of the others ventured to do. Indeed, once she went quite up the narrow channel under the marble balcony, which threw a broad shadow on the water. Here she would sit and watch the young prince, who thought himself quite alone in the bright moonlight. Slightly voyeuristic, huh? She saw him many times of an evening sailing in a pleasant boat, with music playing and flags waving. She peeped out from among the green rushes, and if wind caught her long silvery white veil, those who saw it believed to be a swan spreading out its wings. On many night, too, when the fishermen with their torches were out to sea, she heard them relate so many good things about the doings of the young prince, and she was glad that she had saved his life when he had been tossed about half dead on the waves, and she remembered that his head had rested on her bosom, and how heartily she had kissed him. But he knew nothing of this at all, and could not even dream of her. She grew more and more fond of human beings, and wished more and more to be able to wander about with those whose worlds seemed to be so much larger than her own. They could fly over the sea in a ship, and mount the high hills which are far above the clouds, and the land they possessed, their woods and their fields, stretched far beyond the reach of her sight. There was so much that she wished to know, and her sisters were unable to answer her questions. Then she applied to her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world, which she very rightly called the lands above the sea. "If human beings are not drowned," asked the little mermaid, "can they live forever? Do they never die, as we do here in the sea?" "Yes," replied the old lady, "they must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years, but when we cease to exist we only become foam on the surface of the water, and we have not even a grave down here of those we love. We have not immortal souls. We shall never live again, but, like the green seaweed, when once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond glittering stars as we rise out of the water. And behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown, glorious regions which we shall never see." "Why have not we an immortal soul?" asked the little mermaid mournfully. "I would give gladly all 100 of years that I have to live to be a human being only for one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness that a glorious world above stars." "You must not think of that," said the old woman. "We feel ourselves to be much happier and much better off than human beings." "So I shall die," said the little mermaid, "and as foam of the sea I shall be driven about, never again to hear music of the waves, or to see the pretty flowers, nor the red sun. Is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul?" "No," said the old woman, "unless a man were to love you so much that you were more to him than his father or mother, and if all his thoughts and all his love were fixed upon you, and the priest placed his right hand on yours, and he promised to be true to you here and thereafter, then his soul would guide into your body, and you would obtain a share of the future happiness of mankind. He would give a soul to you, and retain his own as well. But this can never happen. Your fish's tail, which amongst us is considered so beautiful, is so on earth to be quite ugly. They do not know any better, and they think it necessary to have two stout props which they call legs in order to be handsome." Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sorrowful at her fish's tail. Let us be happy, said the old lady, and darted a spring about during 300 years that we have to live, which is really quite long enough. After that we can rest ourselves all the better. This evening we're going to have a court ball. Pre-check. Ooh, this is a long story. Wasn't prepared for its length. In one of those splendid sights which we can never see on earth, the walls and ceilings of the large ballroom were of thick but transparent crystal. Many hundreds of colossal shells, some of deep red, others of grassy green, stood on each side in rows, with blue fire in them, which lighted up the whole saloon, and shone through the walls, so that the sea was so illuminated innumerable fishes, great and small, swam past crystal walls, and on some of them scales glowed with purple brilliancy, and on others they shone like silver and gold. Through the halls flowed a broad stream, and in it danced the mermen and the mermaids to the music of their own sweet singing. No one on earth has such a lovely voice as theirs. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than them all. The whole court applauded her with hands and tails, and for a moment her heart felt quite gay, for she knew she had the loveliest voice on earth or in the sea. But soon she thought again of the world above her, for she could not forget the charming prince, nor her sorrow that she had not an immortal soul like his. Therefore she crept away silently out of her father's palace, and watched everything with gladness and song. She sat on her own little garden, sorrowful and alone. Then she heard the bugle sound through the water, and thought, "He is certainly sailing above, he on whom my wishes depend on, and in whose hands I should like to place the happiness of my life. I will venture all for him, and to win an immortal soul with my sisters are dancing, while my sisters are dancing in my father's palace. I will go to the sea witch, of whom I have always been so much afraid, but she gives me counsel and help." Ooh, the sea witch. The sea witch. We're gonna pause here. I want to try to keep these kind of short. We're gonna pause at the sea witch. There's a party going on. Her grandmothers warned her against this, but her heart goes out to this prince. We'll just have to wait and see what happens next when she visits the sea witch. Good evening.